Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Orphic Astrology channel. My name is Natalia Alas. Today, we are looking at the astrology of November 2025. But before we get into the celestial forecast for November, I'd like to go over some of the events that lined up with October's transits and predictions. There was a lot to report on in October, so I won't be getting into every event, but we'll try to focus on some of the highlights instead. Last month, we had the key transits of Mercury and Mars in Scorpio, along with the building grand water trine between the two malefics and Jupiter. We also saw Venus ingress Libra after a period of being fallen and conjoined the South Node in Virgo through eclipse season back in September. Venus's Libra ingress has been a welcome reprieve, supporting our equanimity in the midst of chaos and encouraging our demands for social justice. And we could even say that Venus in Libra has also been supporting our transition out of the last eclipse cycle by helping us to integrate experience with a touch of grace. Venus will be entering the sign of her nocturnal exile the first week of November and shifting gears to address her more shadowy qualities in Scorpio. October began with Mercury's ingress into Scorpio squaring Pluto in Aquarius, followed by its conjunction to Mars that led up to the new moon in Libra. In the Libra new moon overview with Antoinette Mackenzie, I mentioned that the heliacal rise of Spica would likely reveal more about the Epstein files and other related topics connected to the exploitation or trafficking of children and women. The new moon in Libra was conjunct Spica, so it represented a seeding moment for Spica's significations, which include the innocent or harm to the innocent when afflicted. And Spica's association with Persephone also makes me think of human trafficking, in particular young girls. So I was wondering if we would see more around the Epstein files, or if there would be some evidence that would come to light when Spica makes her first visibility and heliacal rise. And we did. At the end of October, Spica began rising in most latitudes in the northern hemisphere, conjunct Venus, and in those days we saw headlines pertaining to the Epstein files. There was the announcement that King Charles III stripped his brother Andrew of his remaining titles and evicted him from his royal residence after months of pressure to act over his relationship with the pedophile and sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. A report also came out the last week of October and made the news as Spica was rising conjunct Venus that JP Morgan Chase had flagged over $1 billion in suspicious transactions involving Epstein and prominent Wall Street figures back in 2019 after his death. The report was released by JP Morgan Chase and highlights the involvement of Leon Black, a co-founder of private equity firm Apollo Global Management and a former MoMA chairman, the billionaire hedge fund manager Glenn Dubin, celebrity attorney Alan Dershowitz, and retail magnate Leslie Wexner, among others. In mid-October, as Mercury was applying to Mars in Scorpio, there were also lawsuits filed against banks with ties to Jeffrey Epstein. Legal experts have stated that these lawsuits could further reveal Epstein's ties and overcome the partisan gamesmanship blocking justice for survivors to accomplish what lawmakers have repeatedly failed to do thus far. The Bank of America, BOA, and the Bank of New York Mellon, BNY, are alleged to have illicitly enabled Epstein's sex trafficking. So JP Morgan Chase came out with their report at the end of October to avoid being implicated along with BOA and BNY by showing that they had actually flagged the suspicious transactions involving Epstein and his cronies and even notified the Trump administration back in 2019, which we all know they did nothing about because Trump is in the files and is probably at the very top of the list. So that has been interesting to see in light of Spica's heliacal rising conjunct Venus in the scales of justice and exposing the corrupt scales of Wall Street financing. Also, Mercury's conjunction with Mars saw other wild headlines. The day that Mercury perfected its partile conjunction with Mars, there was the grand heist at the Louvre in Paris. And while the Mercury-Mars conjunction was the most immediate reflection of this, I had also pointed out in the Libra new moon overview, which came out the day before the heist, that the trine between Mars and Jupiter was seen by medieval Persian astrologers to indicate theft and concealment of theft, among other things. So there was stacking testimony for this event. Again, as Spica made her first visibility conjunct Venus, the suspects involved in the Louvre heist were taken into custody at the end of October. While many consider the arrest of these suspects as a form of justice, the heist itself brought to light the history of colonial looting and exploitation of precious stones and resources from the Americas and the African and Indian continents by European imperialists. Furthermore, Parisian investigators have stated that the arrests have not uncovered the loot, which is valued at over 100 million euros. So the concealment of theft indicated by the Mars-Mercury-Jupiter trine component of the Grand Water Trine is reflecting the still missing jewels. Will they ever be found? The CEO of Art Recovery International has said that if the thieves aren't apprehended within 48 hours of the theft, the stolen jewels will likely not be found. The thieves were apprehended almost 2 weeks following the heist. But if the jewels are tracked down, perhaps they will be uncovered when Mars ingresses Sagittarius and opposes Uranus the first week of November, or when Mercury conjoins Mars again in Sagittarius, or maybe when Mercury retrogrades back into Scorpio and touches close to the degree of the first Mercury-Mars conjunction that occurred on the day of the heist, or perhaps some other time in the future. To be honest, I haven't analyzed the chart of a moment yet, so these are just speculations, and we shall see how this story unfolds. The Mercury-Mars conjunction also reflected the Amazon Web Services outage that took down wide swaths of the internet. And there was a temporary day of nationwide protest in the United States, also coinciding with the Mercury-Mars conjunction the weekend before the new moon in Libra. The No Kings protest received a lot of criticism from Black and Indigenous activists for its failure to address the root of the problems happening in the US. And as a whole, it was a reminder of the majority's complicity with the system, seeing as too many of the protests were gatekept by the police and backed by liberal politicians. And there was no general strike or continuation of it past a single day of marching. People went back to business as usual the next day. So Black, Indigenous, people of color activists were calling it performative rather than actually effective civil disobedience. The Mercury-Mars conjunction did foster the urgency to stand up for a lot of people, but for the reasons of the dominant cultural programming in the US, the No Kings protest couldn't carry the momentum forward. So there is still a deep sense of injustice and mounting oppression across the US, with not just the chickens coming home to roost, as seen by the police departments training with the Israeli occupation forces, and ICE agents also using spyware tested on Palestinians, now on US citizens, to suppress online dissent, and ICE becoming increasingly militarized to traffic and ethnically cleanse American society. But also with the expansion of US imperialism and the US attempting to invade Venezuela and Nigeria, breaking international laws, which is also part of the Grand Water Trine narratives and the dance of the planetary cycles of Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn. So the building Grand Water Trine between Jupiter and the two malefics was also a major transit for October. And in November, we will see a Grand Water Trine with a with different configurations of the planets, which we'll talk about more later. But last month, I mentioned that some of the significations of the grand water trine between Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter would indicate not so light topics. For example, Mars trining Saturn was seen by Persian astrologers as the occurrence of fraud in the affairs of religious figures and rulers, and the confusion of the people because of this. And we see this strongly with the increase in Christian nationalism in the hegemonic empire, especially following the murder of a prominent Christian white supremacist back in September, and with the Zionist propaganda machine ramping up its media infiltration. Mercury conjunct Mars, trining Saturn and Jupiter also indicates charm, thievery, disasters occurring to writers, and in particular, the occurrence of writers being replaced, which makes me think of the increased use of AI and the impending threat of replacing real writers, real creatives, and real workers with its applications, along with censorship and assassination of journalists. Abu Mashar also says that if Jupiter trines or sextiles Saturn, that indicates the appearance or increase of propagandists. And we saw an increase in headlines talking about propaganda from the US, Russia, and of course, the Zionist entity. We also saw the ceasefire in Gaza announced in mid-October, which was part of a prediction I had made because of the grand water trine with the Malefics and Jupiter peaking around 25 degrees, and Mars having started its current synodic cycle at 25 degrees Scorpio back in November 2023. And back then, the first ceasefire was implemented, albeit briefly, before the IOF began bombing civilians again. So I have been wondering if events in occupied Palestine would take another turn when Mars entered Scorpio this year, and especially when Mars began to apply to the grand water trine because of the sensitivity of that degree. 25 degrees Scorpio is also a repeating degree that I've found in my research around the history of the occupation of Palestine. And though the most recent attempt at a ceasefire has been violated daily by the IOF, it does mark a new chapter in the ongoing genocide and Nakba. This is a very heavy topic that I know is weighing on many of our hearts and minds, especially those of us who have family or friends from Palestine, but really anyone who has an ounce of humanity has been utterly shattered in the last 2 years of this daily onslaught on our collective psyche. I pray that Mars's next synodic cycle, beginning in January 2026, with the Mars Cazimi coinciding with the Venus Cazimi in Capricorn, will bring justice for Palestinians. We will talk more about these transits in December and January, but I'm trying to remain hopeful for a more global intervention come 2026 with the Mars return of the ICJ trial that took place in January 2024, back when Mars also made its heliacal rise in the sign of its exaltation. After setting under the beams in the middle of November this year, Mars will be lying hidden until mid-March 2026, when it rises as a morning star in tropical Pisces. Mars will reach tropical Aries in early April and conjoin Saturn at the end of April, which will be another significant chapter in this narrative and in world politics in general. I haven't covered the genocides of Sudan and Congo in detail yet, but the exacerbation of what's going on in these parts of the African continent, along with other political shifts, are interconnected and to me reflected by the cycles of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn as well. The last week of October also saw the rapid development of Hurricane Melissa in the Caribbean, and it was clocked in as the strongest hurricane ever recorded to hit Jamaica directly. It severely impacted the islands of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and the Antilles. And to me, this was also reflected by the Grand Water Trine with its massive storm-like power of a configuration, a monster storm generated by the corruption of waters by capitalist fraud and the exploitation of Mother Earth. Another striking headline that occurred was news around Elon Musk and his remarks regarding the robot army he envisions for the future. The day after the new moon in Libra, while Luna was applying to Mercury and Mars, activating the Grand Water Trine, Musk announced to his investors that he would walk away from the project if they don't agree to award him an astonishing $1 trillion payout and allow him to maintain direct influence to how the Optimus robots will perform. Tesla shareholders are set to vote on the payout in November, and this could make the already richest man in the world the first trillionaire over the coming decade if Tesla hits some metrics, including 20 million vehicle deliveries, a million robo-taxis, and a million Optimus humanoid robots. I feel this is also tied to the Uranus and Gemini narrative and the age of air we have entered with the Grand Conjunction in Aquarius back on December solstice of 2020. But the first Grand Water Trine between Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn specifically marks a chapter in the ongoing transits of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, which will be pivotal in the unfolding of the age of air. And it also makes me think of how in 2032 there will be a massive planetary conjunction in Gemini. So this story concerning the Optimus robots, I think we'll see a reckoning in the 2030s. But that's a lot to unpack and deserves its own separate video. Let me know if you want me to explore the astrology of the 2030s more in future videos. These were just some of the headlines that struck me with October's astrology. As always, please feel free to comment what stood out for you, and make sure to like this video and subscribe if you're new to my channel. Now onto November's transits. The transit calendar I put together every month includes the key fixed stars, heliacal rising, first visibility dates for my Patreon members' locations, along with the Hecatea on every new moon that commences the Hellenic Hearth ceremonies, followed by the Numenia on the first sighting of the waxing crescent moon, then the day of the Agathodaimon and the Hemera Aphrodites, or the fourth day sacred to Aphrodite. So you'll see these marked on the calendar for the day of the new moon and the first days of the waxing crescent light. November sees the heliacal rising of the fixed star Vega, along with the continued first visibility of Spica in the northernmost latitudes and in the southern hemisphere. Some locations along 25 to 38 degrees north will also see Alphecca and the Corona Borealis constellation rising at the beginning of the month finally. And Arcturus finally appears in some locations in the southern hemisphere by the end of November and into December. Ras Al Hag will also make its first visibility in Paris and along the 48-degree north latitude at the end of the month, continuing into December. We'll be discussing these fixed stars in the monthly live chat for my tiered members on Patreon. So if you're interested in learning more about star lore and how to work with the fixed stars and astrological and magical applications, I encourage you to become a member and join me there. November begins with Mercury freshly ingressed into the sign of its exile, Sagittarius, and separating from an opposition to Uranus, which perfected on October 28th or the 29th, depending on your location. Venus in Libra opposes Chiron retrograde in Aries, forming a T-square with Jupiter in Cancer on November 2nd. This can represent sensitive triggers around relationships and self-inflation or justifying conceitedness from old wounds. It can also reflect the tensions in society from compounded trauma resulting from the delay in delivering justice to those who have been wronged or harmed. So be gentle with yourself and others this first week of November with the waxing gibbous moon in Aries illuminating our sensitivities around these matters. Mars is trailing behind Mercury now and will ingress Sagittarius on the 4th, the day before the full moon in tropical Taurus or Bharani Nakshatra on the 5th or 6th, depending on your location. For more on the full moon, check out my conversation with Sanchia Luz and my video on the 3 magical plant allies for the lunation, which will be published soon after this monthly forecast. Venus then ingresses tropical Scorpio the day after the full moon on the 6th and squares Pluto in Aquarius on the 7th, the same day that Uranus regresses back into Taurus. In Scorpio, Venus reflects back to us our shadows in relationships and can also represent a scarcity mindset from being in the sign furthest from her preferred earthy abode, and therefore no longer having access to her resources to feel at ease. Venus here acts more alchemically and seeks to transform through relationships. And with that, there can be intense highs and lows. And in a square aspect with Pluto, the obsession over power in intimate or public dynamics may become blatantly obvious. Obsession, deception, or the difficulty in letting go of false love or connection are other possibilities, other possible liabilities. But if Venus is transiting one of your angles at this time, she may deliver her agenda that is unique to your natal promise, which will appear differently from person to person. On a mundane level, Venus squaring Pluto may show up as humanist struggles, and it makes me think about women leaders being challenged in their authority as one example. Mercury also stations retrograde at 6 degrees Sagittarius on the 9th and conjoins Mars for the second time, but this time in the sign of the Archer, trining by sign the last quarter moon in Leo on the 12th. This configuration can be very confrontational and show up as heightened conflict from verbal misunderstandings or intentional insult, but it can also represent sorcery and metalsmithing, working with the hands and fire to create something practical, whether it be a protective amulet or a shield of protection or a weapon. I'm not saying here that this is an election for consecrating talismanic objects, but rather Mercury conjunct Mars can indicate working in this way. It can also show up as gossip and arguments, people popping off, road rage, theft, and the execution or carrying out of military campaigns and even uprisings or counter demonstrations. In Sagittarius, Mercury conjoined with Mars can represent more brashness and force from the bravery of this sign. And being in Mercury's fiery exile can represent arson that turns into a wildfire or the burning of a tower moment. Mercury is dramatically slowed down here and will be overcome by Mars, so the implications for the more martial significations may be more noticeable this time. The day following the Mercury-Mars conjunction in Sagittarius, Mars makes its evening setting under the beams of the sun on the 13th and will be in its lying hidden phase until mid-March of next year. That same week, we see Jupiter and Saturn coming very close to perfecting their trine to each other as Jupiter stations retrograde on the 11th at 25 degrees Cancer. Saturn is stationary at 25 degrees Pisces and will finally go direct at the end of the month. This event of one planet stationing before perfecting an aspect to the other was referred to as revoking by Abu Mashar and is considered to nullify the connection. So Jupiter's stationing retrograde this year will be noticeable around the themes of propaganda and political deception and secrecy. The grand water trine gets reactivated by the sun reaching 25 degrees Scorpio on the 17th, shedding light on some of these topics, possibly. And then Mercury will regress back into Scorpio on the 18th to oppose Uranus retrograde again, but this time in Taurus. So this may be reflecting glittery or technological mayhem, perhaps calling attention to technofascism or the banks, the markets, or investigative journalism exposing fraud. This is followed by the new moon in tropical Scorpio, which coincides with Mercury retrograde's inferior conjunction on the 20th or the 21st, depending on your location. We'll explore this lunation in more detail with my next special guest later in the month. But generally, the Cazimi during Mercury retrograde is one of my favorite mercurial transits. And for over 5 years now, I've cultivated my relationship with chthonic Hermes through theurgic ritual offerings when Mercury is in the heart of the sun. So I plan to reserve this day for making offerings to Hecate and chthonic Hermes. This will be devotional as opposed to any sort of manifestation or talismanic magic. I wouldn't recommend making any sort of talismanic object under this lunation because of the opposition to Uranus, but that's just me. The day of the new moon and Mercury retrograde Cazimi, Uranus retrograde also sextiles Neptune retrograde. And before ingressing into tropical Sagittarius, the Sun in Scorpio will oppose Uranus in Taurus one last time. The annual Uranus opposition has been associated with literal earthquakes and tectonic activity, and it can represent the wild card or epiphanies, revelations, the proverbial veils being lifted. Uranus sextile Neptune may indicate lightning flashes of spiritual insight or ripples in the murky waters of perception. Mercury then rejoins the grand water trine on the 22nd. Venus catches up with Mercury retrograde and they make a partile conjunction at 22 degrees Scorpio at 1:51 a.m. Universal Time on November 25th or the 24th for those of you in the Americas. This happens just hours before Mercury emerges past the beams of the sun and makes its first visibility as a morning star on the morning of the 25th at 22 degrees Scorpio. So we'll be able to see Mercury conjunct Venus in the early morning hours on that day. This Venus-Mercury conjunction may be a beneficial time for creative expression that delves into scorpionic depths, purging and purification through creative mediums. Mercury's morning rise is also a time of reflective foresight that can bring critical self-understanding and a deeper understanding of how to move forward or take direct action. This also makes me think of the royal jewels that were stolen from the Louvre because of Venus's association with precious stones and jewelry and luxury, and Mercury revealing secrets around the theft once he's visible again, perhaps. Soon after her conjunction with Mercury, Venus applies to the second grand water trine around 24 to 25 degrees Scorpio. This will reflect a different tone of events, with now both benefics trining Saturn as opposed to both of the malefics trining Jupiter, like we saw at the end of October. Nevertheless, Venus in trine with Saturn in particular has been associated with corruption occurring to children and reproductive rights. So there may be events tied to the impediment of reproductive health care or children's rights around this time. Venus then makes her morning setting and last day of visibility as a morning star on the 26th, while in this activated grand water trine. Venus will be under the beams until mid-February 2026. She enters this lengthy period of her lying hidden phase while completing the grand water trine and in opposition to Uranus before ingressing tropical Sagittarius on the 30th of November or December 1st, depending on your location. Venus's lying hidden phase, when she transitions from morning to evening star, is also connected to affairs and negotiations behind the curtain. and is considered to be less effective in delivering her agendas due to her apparent invisibility. But we will just dissect this transit in more detail in December. Mercury stations direct at 20 degrees Scorpio on the 29th and will be in its post-retrograde shadow until mid-December. Overall, November carries celestial signatures that can be supportive of our inner reflections and transformations, bringing our concerns around personal and parasocial relationships, sustainability, and resources into question, and our relationship to the greater struggles occupying the minds of many under the weight of oppression. Wherever there's shadow, there is light, and the potential to transmute and alchemize experience into wisdom. Let me know in the comments what stands out to you this month, if you have any placements being activated, and what you're most or least looking forward to in November. A happy birthday to all the November Scorpios and Sagittarius out there. A special shout out to my wonderful patrons and all of my subscribers. I hope you continue to gain insight from these monthly transit overviews and that they help you to prepare or plan ahead and make sense of world events. Don't forget to share this with your friends if you got something out of it. And I'm recording this a bit late on Day of the Dead, so I'm wishing you a blessed Dia de los Difuntos y los Canchules, as we say in Cuscatlan, aka El Salvador. Dia de Muertos, Toussaint, All Saints Day to those who celebrate. And I'm wishing you all a blessed November from across the waters here in Dahomey, also known as the Republic of Benin. Stay safe and smart out there, and I'll see you next time. Ciao.